Frank Miller had spent nearly his entire life on this land, a broad, wind-swept expanse of North Texas prairie that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. 80 acres of rough pasture, winding streams, dense thickets of mesquite and live oak, weathered fences stretching out toward the low horizon. It wasn't much to look at least not through the eyes of someone raised in the city, but for Frank it was everything. He had grown up here, learned to work cattle and mend fence with his father and grandfather, learned the rhythms of the land and the unspoken code of neighbors who valued boundaries and respect. He'd served his time in the Army decades ago, come home and rebuilt what had been worn down or lost, and now at 62 his life was quieter but no less anchored to the place. He kept a modest herd of black Angus, ran a few beehives for honey, tended the pastures and the woods the way his father had taught him, with patience, not shortcuts. His house was a plain ranch-style home set back half a mile from the county road, with a gravel lane winding past the stock pond and along an old fence line to the front gate. It was the kind of place where people knew to call before they came, and Frank had no use for those who didn't understand that. The trouble had started almost a year ago, though Frank hadn't known it at the time. The property next to his had been sold, a 30-acre parcel that had once belonged to the Coopers, an older couple who'd finally moved closer to town. Frank hadn't paid much attention at first. Folks bought and sold land all the time. But it wasn't long before the new owner, a woman named Karen Wallace, made her presence known. She'd shown up at his gate one afternoon in a shiny white SUV, sunglasses too large for her face, a tablet under one arm, her tone clipped and overly familiar. She'd introduced herself briskly, announced that she was bringing new life to the area, and began asking pointed questions about access to the road that ran along Frank's south fence line. Frank had explained politely at first that the road was private, part of his deeded land, and not for public use. It wasn't maintained by the county. It had never been on the survey as an easement, just an old ranch track, barely wide enough for a pickup, used by Frank to move equipment and check fence. Karen had nodded, smiled too tightly, and then pressed the issue, claiming she had seen county maps that suggested the road was public right-of-way. Frank had offered to show her his title documents and the recorded survey, but she'd waved him off, saying she would get it sorted out with the county. He hadn't thought much more about it, at least not until a few weeks later, when a registered letter arrived from an attorney in Dallas representing Wallace Ventures, LLC. The letter stated in legalistic terms that Karen intended to develop a seasonal agritourism experience on her property, including public nature trails that would require reasonable access via Frank's road. The letter further asserted that Frank's refusal to allow access might constitute an unlawful obstruction of public use, and politely threatened civil action if the matter wasn't amicably resolved. Frank's response had been clear and direct. He'd had his attorney draft a formal reply, complete with title documents and county plat maps, stating unequivocally that the road was private and that no such easement existed. For a while, that seemed to put an end to it. Karen stopped showing up unannounced, and life on the ranch settled back into its usual rhythm. But in early spring, things began to shift again. Frank started noticing strangers wandering along the fence line, sometimes with cameras, sometimes with notepads. He spotted trail markers, bright orange ribbons, tied to mesquite branches on his side of the fence, which he promptly removed. One morning, he found a group of hikers, college-aged kids from the city, camped down by the creek that marked the far end of his property. When he approached, rifle slung across his back as was normal on this land, they claimed they'd been told it was a public trail, part of some new ecotourism initiative. Frank ordered them off, called the sheriff's office to report the trespass, and later that week installed additional cameras along the southern boundary. A few days after that, a flyer appeared in the mailbox of nearly every ranch within 10 miles, a slick, professionally printed announcement of the upcoming Prairie Bloom Festival, hosted by Wallace Ventures. The flyer boasted of guided nature walks, family-friendly activities, and exclusive access to historic ranch trails. Frank's road was featured prominently on the included map, complete with arrows directing festival-goers right through his property. That was the moment Frank knew the situation wasn't going away quietly. He contacted his attorney again, who in turn reached out to the county clerk and confirmed, once more, that no such public access existed. A cease and desist letter was sent, this time more forcefully worded. Meanwhile, Frank reinforced his gates, added new posted signs along the fence, and prepared himself for what might come next. Karen's response was not a legal filing, but an escalation of a different sort. Over the next several weeks, crews of contractors began appearing near the boundary. Surveyors, equipment operators, even a landscape architect who was seen photographing the old oak grove near Frank's pasture. On more than one occasion, the contractors ignored posted signs and entered Frank's land without permission, prompting terse phone calls and, eventually, another sheriff's report. Through it all, Frank remained calm, methodical. He documented everything: photos, video, written logs. He communicated only through his attorney. He spoke with neighbors, some of whom had begun having their own issues with Karen's aggressive push to modernize the area. And he continued about his work. Calving season was underway, fences needed repair after winter storms, and the bees were coming active again. But beneath that steady surface, Frank was growing increasingly aware that he was facing not just a difficult neighbor, but someone with resources, connections, and a willingness to bend or ignore the law to get what she wanted. The final straw came one cool Saturday morning in late April. Frank rose early, as always, to feed and check the stock. As he approached the south gate with his truck, he saw at once that something was wrong. The padlock on the main gate had been cut clean through. Beyond the gate, a rented yellow excavator was parked squarely across the road, its bucket already half dug into the gravel, as if to widen the path. A crew of 3 men, clad in reflective vests, was milling about with clipboards and measuring tapes. Frank brought the truck to a stop, heart steady, mind already assessing the scene. He stepped out, rifle across his back, not raised, just as always when dealing with unknowns on the land. He approached the men and asked, firmly but without hostility, what they were doing on his property. The foreman, a stocky man with a city contractor's badge, replied that they were there per authorization from Wallace Ventures to prepare the access road for an upcoming event. When Frank informed them that no such authorization existed and that they were trespassing on private land, the foreman hesitated, then muttered something about checking with the client, and motioned for his crew to stand down. They hadn't left more than 30 minutes before Karen herself arrived, her white SUV kicking up a plume of dust down the gravel lane. This time, she wasn't alone. Her boyfriend, a sharp-suited man Frank recognized from previous legal correspondence, was in the passenger seat. Karen climbed out, voice already raised, launching into accusations. That Frank was illegally blocking public access, that he had brandished a weapon at her contractors, that she would not tolerate threats and intimidation. Frank, standing calm and measured with his lawyer already on the phone, simply told her again, the road was private. The contractors were trespassing, and if she continued these provocations, he would pursue every legal remedy available. That was when Karen pulled out her phone and, with deliberate theatrics, called 911. "This is Karen Wallace," she said loudly enough for Frank to hear. "I'm at Miller Ranch. There's an armed man threatening us on public property. Please send officers immediately." Frank said nothing, simply stood his ground as her words echoed down the empty road. He knew what would come next, and he was ready. By the time the first patrol car turned down the lane 20 minutes later, Frank had secured the rifle in the house, prepared his documentation, and alerted his attorney to the unfolding situation. He had no intention of being anyone's fool that day. By the time the first deputy stepped out of his cruiser, the dust from Karen's SUV had barely settled. Frank watched from the porch, his stance deliberate and unhurried, a man well aware of both his rights and the necessity of letting the process unfold without provocation. His rifle was locked away in the gun safe, and his papers, a binder of deed records, surveys, and recent legal correspondence, lay on the table just inside the door. The deputy, a lean younger man whose nameplate read Henderson, approached with professional caution, one hand resting loosely near his duty belt but not on it. Frank stepped down off the porch with an even stride, empty-handed, and greeted him calmly. Deputy Henderson explained that they had received a report of an armed individual threatening civilians on public property. Frank, keeping his tone level, replied that the report was false, that the individuals in question had been trespassing on his private land, that no threats had been made, and that he had extensive documentation to prove ownership of both the road and the adjoining land. Henderson nodded, but said that he was obligated to take statements from both parties and to assess the situation fully before determining the next steps. Frank gestured toward the house, inviting him to review the documents inside. As they entered, Frank's attorney called, on speaker, just as planned. Frank gave a brief update while Henderson waited patiently, making notes in a small spiral-bound pad. The deputy seemed professional and not prone to jumping to conclusions. That, at least, was one small relief. Meanwhile, outside, Karen was pacing along the freshly dug trench by the excavator, her voice raised as she spoke rapidly into her phone. A second patrol car arrived a few minutes later with an older deputy, a seasoned man named Morales, whom Frank recognized from previous community meetings, at the wheel. Morales conferred briefly with Henderson, then made his way to Karen while Henderson remained with Frank, reviewing the binder of documents. It was then that Frank noticed another vehicle arriving, a black county government SUV bearing the emblem of the Land Use Office. From it stepped a mid-level county official named Slater, a bureaucrat whose signature Frank had seen on one of the early responses to Karen's inquiries about trail access. Slater, clipboard in hand, looked uncertain, as though regretting his involvement in what had clearly become a heated property dispute. Morales, after listening to Karen's animated accusations, motioned Slater over and began asking pointed questions about whether any official public easement had ever been established through Frank's property. From Frank's vantage point inside the house, it was clear that no straightforward answer was forthcoming. Henderson, for his part, took his time with the paperwork. He noted the dates of the property survey, the recorded plat maps, and the legal correspondence from Frank's attorney affirming the road's private status. He asked whether Frank had any video of the morning's events. Frank nodded, pulled up the relevant footage from his security cameras, and offered to export the files to a thumb drive for official review. The footage showed the rented excavator parked squarely on Frank's land, the workers arriving without notice, and Frank approaching calmly with his rifle slung but never raised or handled in a threatening manner. The exchange between Frank and the crew was clearly civil. At no point did Frank make any verbal threats. Outside, Karen's voice had reached a shrill pitch, loud enough that her words could be heard through the partially open window. She was insisting that Frank had waved a weapon at her, had threatened her life, and that she feared for her safety. The deputies, to their credit, appeared unconvinced. Morales spoke quietly into his radio, and not long after, another vehicle, this time an unmarked sedan with government plates, pulled into the drive. It was an assistant district attorney named Rachel King, one of the more pragmatic figures in the county's legal apparatus. Morales had evidently called her in anticipation of the legal complexities of what was quickly escalating from a routine trespass call into something far murkier. King spoke first with Morales, then with Henderson, who briefed her on the documents and the video evidence. Afterward, she approached Frank directly, introduced herself, and asked to view the footage personally. Frank obliged, replaying the relevant segments and answering her questions succinctly. King was no stranger to rural land disputes. Her questions were sharp and well-informed. She asked whether Frank had prior issues with Karen, whether there had been any history of confrontation, and whether he had made any threats either verbally or in writing. Frank answered truthfully, explaining the timeline of events, Karen's initial demands, the legal correspondence, the unauthorized construction attempt, and the current false report to 911. Meanwhile, Morales had taken Karen aside for a more formal statement, this time recording the exchange on his body camera. From a distance, Frank could see Karen gesturing animatedly, her narrative increasingly unmoored from the facts as she described Frank's supposed aggression. More troubling was the arrival of a local freelance journalist, clearly tipped off by someone, perhaps Karen herself. The man began snapping photos from the edge of the property, though he stayed behind the fence line. Deputy Henderson, after conferring again with King, informed Frank that given the evidence presented and the inconsistencies in Karen's account, no charges would be filed against him that day. However, Henderson advised that Karen's false report and the unauthorized construction would be documented for possible prosecution. At that point, King stepped outside and had a firm, private conversation with Karen. The tone of it, judging from Karen's expression, was not favorable to her. Frank remained outwardly calm but inwardly vigilant. He knew from experience that such matters rarely ended cleanly. Karen might face immediate legal trouble, but it was likely that her attorneys would seek to counter with civil claims or further public accusations. The arrival of the journalist suggested as much. Accordingly, Frank's attorney advised that they preemptively prepare a formal press statement and secure affidavits from the workers who had been present, some of whom, judging by their hurried departure, had little interest in further entanglement. As the deputies began to wrap up their on-site investigation, Morales informed Frank that Karen would be detained temporarily for questioning, based on the apparent falsity of her emergency call and the potential for obstruction of lawful property rights. Karen's shrill protest resumed as she was escorted, unharmed but visibly furious, to the waiting patrol car. Her boyfriend, red-faced and seething, made several thinly veiled threats of legal action, which Morales calmly noted on his report. With the immediate confrontation diffused, Frank returned to the house to debrief with his attorney and review next steps. The legal strategy would be twofold: pursue Karen for damages related to the unauthorized excavation and false report, while simultaneously reinforcing the legal clarity of the road's private status through updated filings with the county recorder's office. Additionally, Frank's lawyer suggested filing for a restraining order to prevent further harassment and to forestall any attempt by Karen to stage future provocations. The adrenaline of the morning had worn off, replaced by a cold, methodical focus. Frank knew better than to declare victory. The true battle would unfold in the weeks ahead, in courtrooms and county offices, not at the edge of a dirt road. Yet, in that moment, as the last of the patrol cars rolled away and the sun began its slow descent across the prairie, he felt the solid ground of his land beneath his boots and resolved, as his father would have said, that he would stand that ground. Come what may, the days following Karen's detainment unfolded with an eerie, strained quiet. The spring rains came late that year, leaving the land brittle beneath a relentless sun, and Frank spent the better part of the week tending his cattle and making repairs to the south fence, which had suffered damage from the intrusion of Karen's contractors. The gouges left by the excavator's treads had scarred the narrow road, and although Frank had no intention of reopening it for use by anyone but himself, he methodically graded the worst of the ruts, unwilling to leave his property in disrepair. It was work that cleared the mind, sweat and steel against earth, and Frank welcomed it, knowing that the true storm was yet to come. His attorney had been blunt during their latest call. While Karen's false 911 report had provided clear grounds for legal action, and the sheriff's department had moved forward with charges for filing a false emergency call, the likelihood of a swift resolution was slim. Karen's attorneys, big city litigators with a reputation for aggressive tactics, had already filed motions to dismiss the charges and were simultaneously preparing civil counterclaims. Among these was a spurious assertion that Frank had committed intentional interference with lawful commercial enterprise by blocking access to the supposed public trail through his property. It was an absurd argument, unsupported by any actual easement or legal precedent, but it would nevertheless force Frank into a costly and protracted legal defense. Meanwhile, the Prairie Bloom Festival remained advertised on Wallace Ventures' website, albeit with a vague disclaimer that details are subject to change pending county review. The festival's page was now peppered with thinly veiled accusations about local obstructionists and uncooperative landowners, casting Frank in the role of small-minded villain standing in the way of community progress. To Frank's dismay, the online chatter was beginning to spread beyond the immediate area, fueled in part by the coverage of the earlier confrontation. The freelance journalist who had appeared at the gate that day had posted a slanted article on a regional news blog, framing the incident as a clash between tradition and modern eco-tourism. While the article included no direct accusations against Frank, likely for fear of libel suits, it nevertheless painted a picture designed to sway public opinion against him. Frank paid it little mind. He had seen enough land disputes over the years to know that public sentiment, however noisy online, had little bearing on the outcome of a properly prepared legal case. But what concerned him more was the potential for escalation on the ground. He had reinforced his fences, installed additional motion-activated cameras along vulnerable stretches of the property, and retained the services of a licensed security consultant, a former county deputy with an unassuming manner and a sharp eye for potential threats. The consultant, a man named Rob Givens, had walked the property with Frank one crisp morning, offering practical advice on securing the ranch against further incursions. "Look," Givens had said, scanning the tree line near the south road, "you're doing the right things. Cameras here, reinforced gates, legal filings, all good moves. But understand, folks like this, folks with money and something to prove, they'll test you in ways you don't expect. Don't get drawn out. Document everything. Let the system work for you." Frank had nodded in agreement. He had no interest in vigilante heroics. The land was his life, but he intended to defend it through the channels the law provided. For a time, it seemed those preparations might hold. The contractors did not return, and though Karen remained conspicuously absent from the property, her boyfriend was seen driving past the ranch on several occasions, always slowing near the south gate as if taking stock of Frank's defenses. The county prosecutor's office, meanwhile, was moving deliberately on the criminal charges, building a case that would be difficult for even Karen's high-priced lawyers to dismantle. Frank's attorney was quietly optimistic, but advised patience. Then, 2 weeks after the initial confrontation, the situation took a darker turn. It began with an anonymous tip to the County Environmental Board, a complaint alleging that Frank was engaging in illegal dumping of agricultural waste along the creek that bordered the southern edge of his property. Within days, 2 board inspectors arrived unannounced, citing the need to investigate potential violations. Frank greeted them politely but firmly insisted they would not enter the property without a proper warrant. The inspectors, young and clearly uncomfortable, withdrew after a brief exchange, promising to return with the necessary paperwork. The warrant, hastily issued based on the anonymous tip, arrived 3 days later. Frank's attorney filed an immediate motion to quash it on grounds of insufficient evidence, but in the meantime the inspectors returned, this time accompanied by a deputy, as required by protocol. Frank complied fully, allowing the inspection to proceed under careful observation. The inspectors found nothing, no waste, no contamination, no violation of any kind. But the incident sent a clear message. The fight was expanding beyond the civil courts. The pattern repeated itself in other forms. One morning, Frank awoke to find a section of the north fence cut clean through, the wire coiled neatly beside the posts. There were no tire tracks, no footprints. Whoever had done it had been deliberate and careful. Another morning, a delivery truck appeared with a shipment of lumber addressed to Wallace Ventures. The driver insisted that the delivery location was the Miller Property Access Road. Frank turned him away, documenting the incident and forwarding the information to his attorney. Meanwhile, the festival website continued to update with ever more grandiose claims, now including guided river walks that implied access to the very creek along Frank's boundary. When Frank's attorney sent a formal cease and desist letter regarding the unauthorized use of his property in promotional materials, the response from Wallace Ventures was a defiant public statement accusing local forces of harassment and intimidation. Through it all, Frank remained outwardly composed, though the strain was undeniable. He spoke frequently with his attorney and with Givens, who now made regular patrols of the property. He coordinated with the sheriff's office, ensuring that any further incidents would be logged and investigated. And he continued his daily routines, feeding stock, repairing fence, tending to the land as he always had. The ranch was not merely his livelihood, it was his heritage, and he would not be driven from it by the machinations of outsiders. But the most brazen act was yet to come. Late one evening, as Frank was preparing to close down the barn for the night, motion alerts from the southern cameras lit up his phone. He checked the feed and saw headlights approaching the gate, too late for any legitimate visitor. He armed the security system, retrieved his sidearm, not to brandish, but to have on hand, and stepped out onto the porch to observe. What he saw was astonishing. A flatbed truck had arrived, carrying portable fencing panels and stage scaffolding. Two men in work clothes were unloading equipment, clearly intending to set up an installation along the disputed road. One of them wore a vest emblazoned with the logo of a well-known event contractor. Frank called the sheriff's office immediately, reporting an unauthorized intrusion in progress. Then he called Givens, who was in town but promised to arrive within 20 minutes. Frank did not approach the workers. He remained on the porch, lights on, cameras recording, waiting for law enforcement to arrive. Within 15 minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up, lights flashing. The deputies questioned the workers, who claimed they had been contracted by Wallace Ventures and instructed to begin preliminary setup for the upcoming festival. Presented with no permits, no land use authorization, and no permission from the property owner, the deputies ordered them to cease operations and remove the equipment. By the time Givens arrived, the workers were hastily reloading the flatbed under the watchful eye of the deputies. Frank provided his usual calm statement, documenting the incident for the growing case file. The lead deputy, Morales again, shook his head as he prepared the report. "She's pushing hard," Morales said quietly, "trying to provoke a response, maybe force an injunction she can twist in court." "You're handling it right. Keep it clean." Frank nodded. He intended to do exactly that. But, as the flatbed rolled away and the deputies departed, Frank stood for a long time beneath the vast Texas sky, the stars cold and indifferent above. The battle for his land was no longer a simple legal dispute. It was a campaign of attrition, designed to exhaust, to intimidate, to wear down resolve. Frank Miller was many things: a rancher, a soldier, a man of principle. But above all, he was a man who understood endurance. And as he locked the gate behind him that night, he resolved anew that he would see this fight through to the bitter end if necessary. By the first week of May, the heat had begun to settle heavy over the land, the kind of early Texas heat that shimmered in waves off the hard-packed ground by midday and left the air thick with dust and pollen. Frank rose each morning with the sun, tending to his stock and walking the fence lines before the heat grew too punishing, but there was no denying the undercurrent of tension that now threaded through even the simplest of chores. Every motion alert from the cameras prompted a flicker of vigilance. Every unfamiliar vehicle on the county road drew his gaze a second longer than before. The land remained steady beneath his boots, but the air around it had shifted, as if the very boundary between peace and conflict now stood razor-thin. His attorney, for her part, remained unflinching. The legal strategy was sound. Karen's false report had resulted in formal charges that the district attorney was pursuing methodically, and her continued use of Frank's land in promotional materials, combined with the unauthorized equipment drop, had bolstered the civil case for trespass and damages. But as the attorney had warned, the opposing counsel was employing every available tactic to muddy the waters, from motions to delay to spurious filings designed to create procedural headaches. The strategy was clear: force Frank to bleed time and money while sowing confusion in the court of public opinion. It was in this atmosphere of slow-burn escalation that the next move came, not through the courts or by another attempted incursion, but through the machinery of a county bureaucracy itself. The first hint arrived in the form of a letter from the county tax assessor's office, notifying Frank of an impending reassessment of his agricultural use valuation. The timing was suspect. Such reassessments were typically conducted on a rolling schedule, and Frank's land had passed its most recent review just the year before with no issues. A call to the assessor's office yielded little more than polite deflection. "Just part of our routine checks, Mr. Miller." But Frank knew better. Someone had likely lodged a complaint or request for review, triggering the reassessment in the hope of undermining his long-held ag exemption and saddling him with an inflated property tax bill. At the same time, whispers began circulating through the local ranching community. A rumor, carefully seeded, suggested that Frank was preparing to sell out to developers, that his resistance to the public trail was merely a negotiating ploy. Frank heard the talk at the feed store, at the co-op, even at church on Sunday. It was nonsense, of course. He had no intention of selling now or ever, but the rumor served its purpose, casting doubt on his motives and eroding the quiet solidarity that had thus far held among his neighbors. Through all this, Frank maintained his course. He doubled down on documentation, ensuring every aspect of his agricultural operations was meticulously recorded and up to date. He worked closely with Givens, whose security patrols continued to deter further physical incursions, and he remained in constant contact with his attorney, who prepared a formal challenge to the reassessment and initiated inquiries into the source of the anonymous complaint. Then, one humid morning, the situation escalated in a wholly unexpected direction. Frank was in the barn checking supplies when Givens called, voice tight with urgency. "You're going to want to see this," he said. "South line, by the creek." Frank arrived within minutes. What he found left him momentarily speechless. A series of freshly installed trail markers, bright metal stakes with reflective tags, had been driven into the ground along the southern boundary, extending from the disputed road all the way to the edge of the creek. Attached to one of the stakes was a laminated placard bearing the logo of a state conservation fund, along with text proclaiming the area part of a newly designated public nature corridor. Givens pointed to faint tire tracks nearby. "Looks like they came through after midnight. No camera hits, though. They must have parked on the county road and hiked in." Frank's mind worked quickly, parsing the implications. The use of a state agency logo suggested an attempt to cloak the move in official legitimacy, perhaps to lay groundwork for an adverse possession claim, or to pressure the county into backing Karen's so-called trail initiative. His first call was to his attorney. The second was to the district attorney's office, which, after reviewing photos of the markers, launched an immediate inquiry. Within hours, the conservation fund in question issued a public statement disavowing any involvement, declaring the signage unauthorized and vowing to cooperate with the investigation. The placards were removed under official supervision, but the incident marked a dangerous new phase: the use of forged or misleading documentation to bolster Karen's position. For Frank, it was a sobering moment. The battle was no longer confined to the realm of civil disputes and personal trespass. Now, the integrity of public records and official processes was under attack. The potential for broader legal consequences, for both sides, had grown considerably. It was in this tense climate that the next significant development unfolded. One afternoon, as storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, Frank received an unexpected visit from Deputy Morales. The veteran lawman arrived without sirens or fanfare, parking by the house and greeting Frank with a firm handshake. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Morales got to the point. "We've been reviewing some additional footage," he said. "Body cams, dash cams from the day of the call, plus your security videos. There's a clear discrepancy between what Ms. Wallace reported and what actually occurred." Frank nodded. He had known as much, but hearing it from Morales confirmed that the investigation was progressing. "What's more," Morales continued, "we've uncovered evidence that her initial permit applications for the festival included false declarations, specifically claiming easement rights that don't exist." Frank's gaze sharpened. "And the DA's office?" "Moving forward," Morales said. "Slowly, carefully, but they're building a solid case. Perjury charges are on the table now, in addition to the false report." It was a pivotal moment, the clearest indication yet that the tide might be turning in Frank's favor. But Morales, ever pragmatic, cautioned patience. "Don't let your guard down," he advised. "If she's desperate enough to forge trail markers, she's desperate enough for other stunts. Keep everything documented. Stay above board." Frank assured him he would. The stakes were too high for anything less. As Morales departed and the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the prairie, Frank stood on the porch, watching the sky darken. The coming storm mirrored the battle still unfolding around him, slow building, relentless, fraught with unseen currents. Yet beneath it all, the land remained constant, a foundation of stone and soil that no scheme or false claim could truly undermine. And Frank Miller, grounded in that earth and in the quiet strength of his convictions, would stand firm as long as the fight required. The storm that rolled in that evening broke hard over the prairie, a wall of wind and rain that battered the house and drove torrents of muddy water down the dry creek beds. Frank spent most of the night awake, checking the barns and outbuildings, securing what he could against the gusting wind. By dawn, the worst had passed, leaving the land drenched and glistening beneath a pale, washed-out sky. The air was cooler, scrubbed clean by the rain, but Frank sensed the calm would not last. He had learned to read storms, both in the sky and in people, and this one, this fight for his land, was still far from spent. In the days that followed, the legal skirmishing intensified. Karen's attorneys filed a flurry of new motions, seeking to delay the criminal proceedings and challenging the validity of the charges. At the same time, a separate civil suit was initiated against Frank personally, accusing him of intentional infliction of emotional distress, and claiming he had subjected Karen to public humiliation and reputational harm. The Iwa suit was thin on substance but thick with inflammatory language, clearly crafted for maximum media impact. It was a transparent attempt to shift the narrative, to cast Karen as the victim of a vendetta rather than the architect of an escalating campaign of harassment. Frank's attorney moved swiftly to counter, filing motions to dismiss and preparing a comprehensive evidentiary response. The false narrative would not stand unchallenged. Still, the tactics had their effect. Local news outlets, hungry for controversy, seized on the civil suit, running headlines that framed the dispute as a bitter feud between an embattled landowner and a progressive entrepreneur seeking community access. The reality, of course, was far more complex, but complexity rarely made good copy. Meanwhile, the pressure on the ground continued to build. One morning, as Frank made his rounds along the south fence, He discovered that someone had driven steel spikes into the dirt road at irregular intervals, an obvious attempt to sabotage vehicle access. The spikes were carefully concealed, their presence betrayed only by faint scarring in the gravel. It was an act of deliberate malice, one that could have caused serious injury had Frank or anyone else driven through unaware. He documented the sabotage meticulously, photographing the scene and filing a formal report with the sheriff's office. The deputies responded quickly, launching an investigation, but no suspects were immediately identified. The act sent a chilling message. The conflict had crossed yet another line, from legal maneuvering to outright physical endangerment. Givens increased his patrols accordingly, now monitoring the property at irregular intervals to deter further acts of vandalism. Frank, for his part, remained vigilant but resolute. He would not be cowed. As tensions mounted, another development unfolded, one that shifted the landscape of the conflict yet again. The district attorney's office, after weeks of careful preparation, formally indicted Karen on multiple counts, filing a false emergency report, perjury related to her permit applications, and attempted fraud in connection with the forged trail designations. It was a decisive move, one that signaled the case was no longer merely a matter of local land dispute, but had entered the realm of criminal accountability. News of the indictment spread quickly, sparking a new wave of media coverage. Karen's attorneys held a press conference, denouncing the charges as politically motivated and vowing to fight them vigorously. But behind the scenes, sources close to the investigation indicated that the evidence was overwhelming. The forged trail markers alone constituted clear grounds for prosecution, and the body cam footage from the initial 911 incident further undermined Karen's credibility. Yet, even as the legal tide turned, the campaign against Frank continued. Anonymous letters began arriving at county offices, alleging code violations on Frank's property, allegations that triggered a series of inspections. The inspectors, though professional, arrived wary, clearly aware of the charged atmosphere surrounding the case. Each inspection found the same result: no violations, no grounds for enforcement. But the intent was clear: to harass, to disrupt, to force Frank onto the defensive. It was during this period of heightened scrutiny that the most brazen provocation occurred. Late one evening, well after dark, a convoy of vehicles appeared on the county road near the disputed south entrance. Frank's cameras captured the approach. 3 SUVs and a pair of the box trucks, headlights off, moving slowly and deliberately. The vehicles stopped just beyond the range of the main security lights, and figures emerged, some carrying equipment, others appearing to scout the perimeter. Frank, alerted by the motion sensors, immediately contacted the sheriff's office, then armed himself and took up position inside the house. He did not go out to confront the intruders. Experience had taught him the value of restraint. Instead, he monitored the feeds closely, noting every movement. The intruders worked quickly, unloading what appeared to be portable fencing and signage. Several of the signs bore the same fraudulent, public nature corridor branding as the earlier markers. It was an organized operation, not the work of overzealous supporters, but a coordinated attempt to establish a physical presence on the land. Within 20 minutes, patrol units arrived, sirens and lights announcing their presence. The intruders scattered, abandoning equipment as they fled. Deputies secured the scene and collected evidence, including high-resolution images from Frank's cameras. Several license plates were recorded, and an investigation into the ownership of the vehicles was launched. The following day, the district attorney's office issued a public statement condemning the illegal incursion and affirming Frank's property rights. The statement marked a rare moment of public clarity in the otherwise murky public discourse surrounding the case. For Frank, it was a welcome affirmation, though he remained wary. The escalation had proven that Karen and her backers were willing to resort to increasingly desperate measures. The impact of the incident rippled outward. The county commission, facing mounting public pressure, convened a special session to review the situation. Several commissioners, previously neutral or silent on the matter, publicly expressed support for Frank's position, citing the clear evidence of trespass and fraud. The tide of local opinion, long clouded by misinformation, began to shift perceptibly. Amidst this evolving landscape, Frank continued to hold his ground. He worked closely with his legal team, now bolstered by additional counsel experienced in property rights litigation. He maintained open lines of communication with law enforcement and county officials, ensuring that each new development was met with a coordinated and lawful response. Yet, through it all, he remained acutely aware of the personal toll. The fight consumed time, energy, and resources. It strained relationships with neighbors wary of becoming entangled in the controversy. It disrupted the rhythms of ranch life that had once provided grounding and solace. But Frank's resolve did not waver. The land was more than acreage and title. It was legacy, identity, and responsibility. To yield would be to betray not only himself, but the generations who had come before. And so, as the long days of early summer stretched across the prairie, Frank prepared for the next phase of the battle. The legal calendar was set. Hearings scheduled, motions filed, depositions underway. The threat of further provocations remained, but so too did the foundation of law and truth upon which his defense rested. In the quiet moments between the storms, beneath the vast Texas sky, Frank found strength in the enduring truth of the land itself. The grass would grow again. The fences would hold. And so would he. The first hearing in the criminal case against Karen was scheduled for a hot June morning, the kind of day when the sun rose hard and fast, driving the temperature into the high 90s before noon. Frank arrived early, dressed plainly in pressed jeans and a clean work shirt, accompanied by his attorney and a quiet determination. The courthouse steps were already crowded with reporters and curious onlookers, drawn by weeks of breathless media coverage. For Frank, the noise and spectacle were an unwelcome distraction, but he understood the importance of presence. This was not merely a legal proceeding. It was the visible assertion of truth against a tide of fabrication. Inside the courtroom, the air was cool and heavy with anticipation. Karen sat at the defense table, flanked by two attorneys and projecting a veneer of composed indignation. Her posture was deliberate, her every gesture calibrated for effect. But beneath the polish, there was tension. Her eyes flicked too quickly across the room. Her hands moved restlessly against the smooth surface of the table. She had staked everything on the narrative of victimhood, and now the structure of that falsehood was beginning to crack. The district attorney opened the proceedings with measured force, laying out the core charges, filing a false emergency report, perjury in the submission of fraudulent permits, attempted fraud through the use of forged trail markers. The case, built meticulously over weeks, rested on a foundation of incontrovertible evidence: video footage, forensic analysis of the forged documents, sworn testimony from county officials and law enforcement. Each element reinforced the central truth. Karen's campaign had been grounded not in community benefit, but in deliberate deception and personal ambition. Frank listened without outward reaction, his gaze steady on the judge. He had no need to savor the moment. Vindication, when it came, would be earned through patience and restraint, not triumphalism. As the prosecution presented its case, the weight of the evidence became undeniable. The video from Frank's security system, combined with deputy body cam footage, clearly refuted Karen's initial 911 claim. Her voice, captured in the call, stood in stark contrast to the calm, measured conduct displayed on the recordings. The forged trail markers, traced through purchase records and manufacturing details, were linked directly to Wallace Ventures, their unauthorized placement documented in detail. The permit applications, riddled with false assertions, further eroded any pretense of innocence. Karen's defense, despite the skill of her attorneys, faltered under the cumulative force of these facts. Attempts to portray her as a misunderstood activist were undercut by the cold precision of the evidence. Efforts to shift blame onto subordinates unraveled beneath sworn affidavits and documentary trails. As the day progressed, it became increasingly clear that the case for the prosecution was not merely strong, it was unassailable. Yet the legal battle was only one front. Outside the courtroom, a parallel conflict continued to simmer. In the days leading up to the hearing, a coordinated campaign of public relations spin had flooded social media and local news outlets, seeking to recast the narrative. Anonymous accounts propagated stories of a repressive landowner stifling community access, while sympathetic bloggers echoed claims of systemic bias and rural elitism. It was a last-ditch effort to salvage public opinion, to blunt the impact of the looming legal defeat. Frank, guided by his attorney and a small circle of trusted allies, responded with deliberate silence. No interviews, no public statements beyond the courtroom. The focus remained on the facts, on the integrity of the process. It was a strategy rooted in principle but also in pragmatism. The court of law, not the court of public opinion, would determine the outcome that mattered. As the hearing entered its second day, the defense signaled a shift. Faced with the mounting weight of evidence, Karen's attorneys moved to negotiate a plea deal. The terms, when conveyed to Frank's legal team, were revealing. Karen would accept a responsibility for the lesser charges, issue a formal public retraction of her claims, and agree to financial restitution for the documented damages, provided the most serious counts were reduced or dismissed. Frank's counsel reviewed the offer with care. It was a tactical concession, aimed at limiting Karen's exposure while conceding the central truth of the case. For Frank, the decision was clear. The principle of accountability mattered more than the specifics of sentencing. If the deal ensured a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing and protected the integrity of his land, it would serve justice. After careful negotiation, an agreement was reached. Karen would plead guilty to filing a false emergency report and to submitting fraudulent permit applications. The remaining charges would be held in abeyance, subject to strict compliance with the restitution terms and a binding order prohibiting any further attempts to assert access rights or interfere with Frank's property. The plea would be entered publicly, on the record. When the moment came, the courtroom was packed. Karen, her composure visibly strained, stood before the judge and entered her plea. The words, though spoken through clenched teeth, carried the force of official acknowledgement. The falsehoods that had fueled months of conflict were laid bare, dismantled in the clear light of legal process. For Frank, the moment was not one of triumph, but of release, a lifting of the oppressive weight that had shadowed his life and land. The fight was not yet over. Civil proceedings remained, and the scars of the conflict would take time to heal. But the core truth had been vindicated. The land stood secure, the rule of law affirmed. As the courtroom emptied and the media frenzy swirled outside, Frank declined all requests for comment. He returned to his truck, drove back to the ranch, and walked the fence lines as he had done countless times before. The air was thick with the scent of sun-warmed grass and the distant hum of bees. The land, timeless and indifferent to human conflict, remained unchanged. Yet within Frank there was a quiet resolution. The defense of the ranch had forged a deeper understanding of what it meant to stand one's ground, not merely in the physical sense, but in the steadfast commitment to truth, to principle, to the enduring bond between land and those who tend it. The battle had tested him, had cost him in ways both visible and unseen. But it had also affirmed something fundamental, that in a world of shifting narratives and manufactured outrage, there remained power in the simple, unwavering facts of place and purpose. And so, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the pasture, Frank stood once more beneath the vast Texas sky, resolute and unbowed. The fight for the land had been waged and won, not with bluster or bravado, but with patience, integrity, and the enduring strength of a man who knew where he stood and why he would never yield. The weeks that followed the courtroom plea unfolded with a strange, muted rhythm. The spectacle of the trial had receded, replaced by a quieter, more deliberate process of closure and repair. Frank moved through each day with a sense of purposeful calm, focused not on vindication or public perception, but on restoring the balance of his land and life. There were practical matters to attend to: documentation of restitution payments, the formal recording of the legal order affirming the exclusive status of his property rights, and the coordination of ongoing security measures to ensure that no further incursions would be attempted. His attorney, steady and thorough to the last, managed the legal tailings with precision, ensuring that every remaining thread of the conflict was tied off in full compliance with the law. For Frank, the return to ordinary routine brought both relief and reflection. The rhythms of the ranch, the feeding of the stock, the maintenance of fence and field, the slow, steady cycles of life bound to the land, offered a kind of grounding that no courtroom victory could match. Yet, beneath the surface, the experience had left its mark. The fight had tested not only his resolve but his understanding of the world beyond the familiar contours of his land. It had revealed the ease with which truth could be twisted, the willingness of some to exploit legal and public channels for personal gain, and the fragility of the assumptions that once seemed so certain. Karen, true to the terms of her plea agreement, had issued a public retraction of her claims, acknowledging the falsehoods at the heart of her campaign. The statement, though crafted with the careful language of legal counsel, left little room for ambiguity. Wallace Ventures ceased operations shortly thereafter. Its website shuttered, its planned festival quietly canceled. Word circulated that Karen had placed her property on the market, seeking to extricate herself from the community where her reputation now lay in tatters. The sale would take time, and there remained no guarantee that a future owner would be free of similar ambitions. But for the present, the immediate threat had passed. Frank made no public statement in response. He had no interest in gloating or in fanning the embers of controversy. The land was his, the record clear, and that sufficed. His focus remained on what mattered: the work of the ranch, the stewardship of the place entrusted to him by generations past. He strengthened the southern boundary, replacing older sections of fence with reinforced steel posts and upgraded wire. He installed additional surveillance equipment, not as a symbol of paranoia, but as a practical measure, an acknowledgement that vigilance, once awakened, could not so easily be set aside. In the community, the ripples of the case lingered. Conversations at the feed store, at church, at local meetings often circled back to the events of the past months. There was sympathy for Frank, respect for the manner in which he had conducted himself, but also a broader unease, a recognition that the dynamics of rural land ownership were shifting, subject to pressures and tactics once thought foreign to such places. For Frank, this awareness carried no bitterness, only a deeper resolve to remain prepared, to stand firm should such challenges arise again. He took quiet steps to reinforce this preparedness. He formalized agreements with his legal counsel for ongoing consultation, ensuring that any future disputes could be met with swift, informed response. He engaged with trusted neighbors to establish clearer channels of communication and mutual support, recognizing that the defense of land and legacy was a responsibility best shared among those who understood its true value. And he committed himself anew to the principles that had guided him through the ordeal: patience, integrity, and a steadfast adherence to the truth. One crisp morning in late summer, as the prairie grasses swayed golden beneath a vast, cloudless sky, Frank walked the southern boundary alone, the hum of insects and the distant lowing of cattle his only companions. The fence stood strong and true, the land beyond it quiet, untouched by the disruptions of months past. He paused by the old oak near the creek. Its gnarled branches stretched wide in silent testament to endurance. The land, like the tree, had weathered the storm, not unchanged, but unbroken. In that moment, Frank understood something deeper than victory or loss. The defense of the land was not a single act or a solitary battle. It was a way of life, a continual commitment to honor and protect what could not be replaced. The past months had tested that commitment, had revealed its cost, but had also affirmed its worth. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the grass, Frank turned back toward the house, the steady rhythm of his stride matching the quiet certainty within him. The fight was done, the land secure, the path ahead clear. And whatever storms might come in the future, he would meet them as he always had, not with anger or fear, but with the unyielding strength of a man who knew where he stood and why.